Welcome to the Jesus Movement to Life. Tonight we are teaching our 45th lesson from our series, A Journey to Faith. Tonight's lesson is called Rehoboam Rules a Divided Israel, and we learn all about what happens when his father passes away, King Solomon, and Rehoboam inherits a kingdom which is going to be divided into north and south. King Jeroboam, who becomes the ruler of the northern kingdom of Israel, and the past relationship that he had with King Shishak, who was, of course, the father-in-law of King Solomon. King Shishak will come back into play, and he will overcome the kingdom of Judah. You'll also learn about what's happening in the region around them and about how the northern kingdom would worship golden calves. A Journey to Faith is a series based on the genealogy of Jesus, which you can find in Matthew chapter 1, verses 1 to 17. Solomon, the son of King David, is the 15th descendant on that genealogical list, starting with Abraham, and of course it goes right through to Jesus. So sit back and relax. Don't forget to press that share button. Let's share the word of the Lord to as many people as possible. And if you do want to watch the video again, you can watch it on our YouTube channel or on our website at thejesusmovement.com.au. Let's begin. Welcome to the Jesus Movement Live. It's a great pleasure to have you here. As the message has just said, we've moved on in our series following along the genealogy of Jesus, and we've come up to the time of life of King Rehoboam. So if you don't know who King Rehoboam is, he's not a name that's mentioned very often. He is the son of King Solomon. But before we begin our lesson tonight, which we've mentioned is titled Rehoboam Rules a Divided Israel, we've just got a little gift here to show you, because we've been talking about King Solomon and the opulent wealth that he actually received. And what I've spent some time doing is converting the value of the gold and the silver that he's been receiving. So there's an extraordinary amount used for the temple. But last week we had a look at what King Solomon is basically earning every year. And it's worth, in today's term, US dollars 726 million. And it's equivalent to 666 talents of gold in the Bible. Now that translates to 18,126 kilograms. And so today my security guards came from the bank and they brought me this very small piece of gold. So this is an actual piece of gold bullion. So this weighs, sorry Tim, how much?
2 ounces.
So this weighs 2 ounces. Right, so this is a 2 ounce bar. I also have with me, so you can get some relevance, a bar of silver, and this bar of silver is actually 1 kilo. Okay, so that's a kilogram of silver. It's extremely heavy for its size, but it's not so big. But when you imagine that King Solomon was receiving on a yearly basis 18,126 grams of gold alone, plus all the silver, it actually says in the Bible that silver was so valueless because they had so much gold that it was only worth the same as stones. And yet here today it's a very valuable commodity. So just wanted to show you those to give you some reality of what they look like, obviously, but just to give you an idea of the size and the weight. So a stupendous amount of volume that was actually available to King Solomon, and showing the wealth and the opulence of the United Kingdom of Israel. However, in last week's lesson, we had a look at the life and times of King Solomon up until when he passed away, and we found that because he married 700 wives and 300 concubines, he started to build altars and high places for all of them. They brought in all of their foreign religions, and child sacrifice, etc., started to happen on the east side of Jerusalem, from the outlook of the temple itself. And so this was abhorrent to God. And so when all of this was happening, God said that there would be a outcome, a consequence for this. And of course that was that the nation, the new United Kingdom of Israel, would actually become split into two. And there's a fellow by the name of Jeroboam who was working on the water on the walls, who was seen to be a good worker, and he was approached by a prophet called Abihar from Shiloh, and this prophet told him that he would become a future king of the northern kingdom of Israel. Now, as the future king, he was going to inherit 10 of the tribes of Israel, which is basically everything north of Jerusalem itself. And so this week we enter into this story from this point in time, and we're going to cover the life of Rehoboam. As I mentioned in this lesson, it's also quite historical, so excuse me for that, it's not my doing. It is the era of the Bible, it is the era of the kings. There is a change in guard in all of the nations around the kingdom of Israel, and it has an influence on them. So we're going to work our way through all of this tonight. So Rehoboam, basically, when King Solomon died, you could say for a breath of a moment, became the king of the United Kingdom of Israel. But this doesn't really take effect, because Israel's 10 northern tribes will rebel in the spring of 931 BC to form an independent kingdom of Israel under this new ruler called Jeroboam. And he is an official that was chosen by God, whom he sent his prophet to. So it can be determined that Rehoboam was born in 971 BC because he ascends the throne at the age of 41. The Bible tells us this in 1 Kings chapter 14 verse 21. So we're in a period of the Bible where we can actually date all of the different kings of the Bible. So the background, so the kingdom of Israel entered into a period of mourning when Solomon died. He would have been buried by dusk on the same day, which was the requirement under the laws. The family of Solomon and those close to him were provided a special meal of condolence afterwards, and those in attendance remained in the palace for a week to pray and share readings from the Torah. Memorial candles were lit, and they were replaced time and time again. The people of Israel also would mourn the loss of their king. Many would have taken to the streets. They would have been wailing and weeping, making a public show of their mourning or their misery. It was not uncommon, you read about it in the Bible, for the men to tear their garments from top to bottom. So they would literally rip their garments apart. Some would roll in the dust, while others took to shaving their heads and putting ashes or dust on their scalp. This is what they do when they're mourning. There were no celebrations and no man went to work. So the nation basically stopped during this time of mourning. After a concentrated 7-day period of mourning passed, the people of Israel were less vocal and emotional, as you can imagine, but the mourning itself would continue for a full 30 days, for that was what was required. Envoys would have come to Jerusalem from many nations to express their condolences to the new king, which of course is Rehoboam, the son of King Solomon. He was the eldest son of Solomon and the next heir to the throne of Israel, but unlike his father Solomon and his grandfather David, the Lord did not appear, nor talk to, nor anoint Rehoboam as the next king. So if you take notice of the Bible, there's things that happen, and then suddenly you notice they don't happen. They're not necessarily spoken of, but by the absence of the fact that they're not spoken of tells you they didn't occur. And so Rehoboam's appointment as king is different to that of Solomon and David before him, who both, of course, had God speak to them directly. So the people of Israel knew that the regulations needed to be filled by their kings. I'm not going to spell out all of the regulations, but if you want to have a look, you can find them in 1 Samuel, and it's found in chapter 10, verse 25. Solomon had started his reign by building the house of the Lord, the temple of Jerusalem, deliberating over his people with unsurpassed wisdom, and leading them through a time of peace, wealth, and prosperity. But as the years passed and he accumulated many foreign wives and concubines, he turned away from the Lord and did not keep the covenant or the decrees. He turned his heart to the worship of foreign gods and did evil in the eyes of the Lord, as the Bible tells us. When it came time for Israel to make Rehoboam king, it was not a democracy, and there was no right to an election, for God had promised David perpetual sovereignty. But if Rehoboam was to rule, they wanted to restore the terms to which he was subject as their constitutional king. Aliens, that is, non-Israelites or foreigners, had always been used as conscripted labour to fulfil projects of construction. Adoniram, son of Abda, had been appointed to be in charge of these projects and those who were forcibly conscripted to work on them. But when the supporting terraces and the gap in the wall of the city of David was being built, Solomon raised a labour force from the house of Joseph. We spoke about this last week. The house of Joseph is the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh. Okay? And so they were the two northern tribes. In obedience to their king, the men from the house of Joseph were obliged to fulfil the task assigned to them, but this did not mean that they were necessarily happy to do so. Amongst the murmurings of a dissatisfied people was an official of Solomon, a young man of standing called Jeroboam Son of Nabat. As the men from the house of Joseph toiled at their work, it was obvious to Solomon that they were performing poorly, so he appointed Jeroboam to be in charge of them. Fully aware of the unpopularity of Solomon among his people, when Ahiah, the prophet of Shiloh, met Jeroboam and said God had chosen him to rule over the 10 tribes of Israel, he must have assured his men all would be well, as he had been appointed their next king. The murmuring men, however, must have spoken what they knew, because Solomon learnt the subordinate God appointed was the official he had appointed in charge of them. Perhaps thinking he could stop God from tearing away the 10 northern tribes from his son Rehoboam, Solomon tried to kill Jeroboam, but the Bible tells us that he escaped to Egypt. And of course, who did he escape to? He escaped to Pharaoh Shishak, and Pharaoh Shishak was the father-in-law of Solomon, whose first wife was the Pharaoh's daughter. And so this we've covered in the previous 2 lessons. So this gives you the background for what Rehoboam has been growing up through. So Rehoboam knew God's plan and the discontent of the northern tribes of Israel. Remember, God told Solomon directly that his kingdom was going to be split into 2. He said to him that it would not happen to him, but it would happen in the next generation, which means to his son Rehoboam. So Rehoboam had walked into this eyes open. He wouldn't have not known that this was the case. Now his father had died, and the people from the 10 northern tribes, especially those from the house of Joseph, were well aware of the prophecy given by the Ephraimite Ahiah of Shiloh. He had reason for concern. Now, going back through the Bible many years earlier, when Jacob gave his blessing before he passed away in Genesis chapter 49, the tribe of Judah had been set apart from the other tribes. It says in Genesis 49 verse 8, "Your father's sons will bow down to you." When David first became king, he became, of course, the king of Judah, this very tribe. His own house or tribe before he became the king of Israel. When God asked David to count the fighting men, he said in 2 Samuel chapter 24 verse 1, "Go and take a census of Israel and Judah." So the Bible differentiated. It didn't say take a census of the kingdom of Israel. It said to take a census of Israel and Judah. So in other words, they were defined as 2 separate entities yet united. Remember when King David first took over and ruled, he first ruled over the tribe of Judah from Hebron before he went further north and overcame the other tribes. And so there's always been this difference between the 10 northern tribes and Judah and Simeon to the south. This was written in 2 Samuel chapter 24 verse 1. There had always been a distinction between the house of Judah and the house of Israel, none more so than now. You've got to wonder, does it make you wonder, why did God say that particular differentiation? 10 tribes up there, the others down at the bottom. By the time the kings had begun, there was no tribe of Simeon anymore. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. And so basically we're left with one tribe, right? The tribe of Judah. The Bible tells us that God kept that one aside for himself because that's where the descendants would come from, of course, for the Messiah, Jesus. So the tribe of Judah would remain loyal to the house of David. We read about this in 1 Kings chapter 12 verse 20. But Rehoboam needed to go to the northern tribes of Israel and have their loyalty if he was to be king over all of Israel like his father. So like all earthly wise people, even though God had sent a prophet to prophesy that this is what's going to happen, Rehoboam, in his earthly strength as the king, decides that he is going to do something about this and go against what God had actually commanded. And thus begins his journey in the Bible. So in 1 Kings chapter 12 verse 1, so we're sort of starting from 1 Kings chapter 12 tonight. Rehoboam, it says, went to Shechem, for all the Israelites had gone there to make him king. And so I'll just put a map up here so we can just reference these places. So here he is in Jerusalem where they're ruling from, and it says that he's going to go to Shechem. Each of the kings, when they were actually crowned to rule over the whole of the kingdom of Israel, were actually crowned in Shechem, not in Jerusalem. And so Rehoboam goes to follow what his father and his grandfather did and go to Shechem, into the heartland of the northern tribes of Israel. He travelled north through the hill country from Jerusalem to Shechem, and he was expecting to be anointed king by his people. But I've already mentioned, it's not the king, it's not people who anoint a king. Right? It's not a democracy. Right? It's the priesthood. Who do the priesthood represent? They represent God. God never spoke to Rehoboam, and God never asked a priest, obviously the high priest now at this time of the Bible, to anoint him. And so Rehoboam goes up to get himself anointed. So he takes it in his own strength to do this. But when he arrived, instead of rejoicing, there was barely a murmur. In fact, there was barely anyone there at all. So their king had arrived and nobody showed up. There was no party. So Jeroboam son of Nabat had been living during this time in Egypt ever since Solomon found out he was a subordinate that the Lord said would receive the kingdom that was to be torn out of his son's hand. So I'm going to give you the backstory now. So we've learned that what's happened up to now. We've learned that King Rehoboam is going to go up to Shechem to get himself anointed. He gets there and there's no one there. So why? And so we revert back to the story that's happening side by side. And this, of course, is Jeroboam's story, who fled to Egypt to King Shishak when Solomon found out that he was to be the one who would inherit the 10 tribes to the north. So ever since Solomon found out he was a subordinate, the Lord said would receive the kingdom, would be torn out of his son, meaning Rehoboam's hands. When news of King Solomon's death reached him, he immediately packed and travelled up the way to the land of the Philistines, or the way to Horus as the Egyptians called it, the coastal highway skirting the eastern end of the Great Sea, which is of course the Mediterranean. He returned to his home in Zeradah in the territory of Ephraim. So what that says is that here's the king, Rehoboam, in Jerusalem. He's heading up the way to Shur. Remember in the Bible the word way, we would equate that to a highway today, but only had one word. So there's no streets, avenues, roads, highways. They were all just called the way. And so he could have come up this way, and this is, pardon the pun, he could have come up this way through Jerusalem back home, but he didn't. He came up the coastal highway around here, which is the way of the Philistines or the way of Horus, and he went up the coast and he basically avoided going across to over here, and he went up to his home. And so His home was called Zeredah in the territory of Ephraim. The people of Israel, not those from the tribe of Judah, were aware of the prophecy given by the Ephraimite Ahiah of Shiloh. When Solomon's son Rehoboam went to Shechem, the place is... Why is Shechem so important? Does anyone remember why is Shechem so important? It's been a major centre for lots of reasons. But what's one of the biblical things that happened when they came back from Egypt? What happened with Shechem?
Wasn't the ark kept there for a while?
No.
Okay.
So it wasn't the ark. Any other thoughts? Remember, the ark was actually kept first at Gilgal, then at Shiloh. They went up through Shechem and they received and built an altar between Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim when they were actually being given their inheritance to spread. But Shechem had a different reason. And the reason that Shechem was important was, first of all, this is a place where Abraham first stopped. And he built his altar to God when he first entered into the land of Canaan. But there's significance, because we keep talking about the tribe of Ephraim and Manasseh and the tribe of Joseph. And we know that this particular prophet comes from the tribe of Joseph in Ephraim, which is this sort of region here. The significance is that Joseph's bones were actually buried in Shechem. It's a significant place for several reasons. And we find that information, if you want to look it up. Joseph's bones were buried in Shechem in Joshua chapter 24, verse 32. The Israelites heard that Jeroboam had returned home from Egypt, so they sent for him. Travelling from Zeredah on the foothills above the coast, Jeroboam arrived in Shechem, nestled in the valley between the impressive peaks of Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim, as we've just mentioned, on the border between the territory of Ephraim and Manasseh. So it's right between the two tribes. The significance of this place was not lost on the Israelites. This was where Joshua renewed the covenant with God and read the book of the law given by Moses when they gave out the inheritance and they assembled the 6 tribes on either side. Once Jeroboam joined the whole assembly of Israel, then they went together to see Rehoboam. So the reason they didn't all show up is because Jeroboam had come up the back door and he had spoken to them and said, I'm the guy who's receiving this inheritance. We're going to be separate from them and I'm going to be your ruler. So when Rehoboam comes running up, Jeroboam and his people aren't running to him. And so this is the circumstance of what's happening. So they knew he'd come back from Egypt. So he travelled up and they went to Shechem. And once Jeroboam joined the whole assembly of Israel, again they went to see Rehoboam. So many days had passed while Rehoboam was there. He was waiting for the northern tribes of Israel to assemble. It was his party, but no one had come. So he sat and he waited. One morning he awoke to the news that they had finally arrived, and he steadied himself before going out to meet them. Rehoboam was confronted with a hostile crowd, and they said to him in 1 Kings chapter 12 verse 4, "Your father put a heavy yoke on us, but now lighten the harsh labour and the heavy yoke he put on us. We will serve you." So again, your father put a heavy yoke on us, but now lighten the harsh labour and the heavy yoke he put on us, and we will serve you. So in other words, King Solomon was building Jerusalem. He built the altar, he built the temple, he was building the walls. Jeroboam was appointed over the workers from the tribe of Joseph, Ephraim and Manasseh. And so when Rehoboam goes up here, they're saying to him, your father was unreasonably hard on us. So it gives you a little bit of an insight into how Solomon was treating those people. And so they're using that as a reason not to be loyal to his son, Rehoboam. So this is what they say to him. Your father put a heavy yoke on us, now lighten the harsh labour, the word harsh, and the heavy yoke he put on us, and we will serve you. So they're saying, we will serve you if you do this. They promised loyalty if he would lessen the burden his father had imposed on them. But Rehoboam, unlike his father, was not known for his wisdom, and God didn't grace him with any. He was lacking in wisdom. So Rehoboam asked the people to leave and return in 3 days. He wanted to think about it and he wanted to consult. So he went to the advice of the elders who had served his father. Now, the issue of Solomon's idolatry and disobedience to God never raised a breath of complaint from the people of Israel. Rehoboam too, as his father's son, never set out to address his father's sin. And so we have this issue of the idolatry going on in the background, and of course it was going to cause a problem. So Rehoboam consulted his father's elders, who advised him in 1 Kings chapter 12 verse 7, give them a favourable answer. But he rejected their advice and sought guidance from the young men that he had grew up with. Who knows that young men full of vitality are going to tell the world what to do, and they make lots of mistakes. And so here they go. They advised him to show no weakness. After 3 days had passed, when Jeroboam and the people of Israel returned, Rehoboam went to them and he spoke to them harshly. And he spat out these words, my little finger is thicker than my father's waist. My father laid on you a heavy yoke. I will make it even heavier. My father scourged you with whips. I will scourge you with scorpions. So how does that make you feel? Here's King Solomon, deemed to be wise, just, and we find out here that he's whipping these people, and they're not foreign aliens. They're his own people from the tribe of Manasseh and Ephraim. And so there's a nice illustration. I popped this up at the end of last week's lesson, and you can see the king sitting here on his throne. He's got his little finger out and he's speaking very nastily to all of the people here. Unfortunately, it is an illustration. If you have a look at the design, it looks like it came out of perhaps 15th, 16th, 17th century England or Europe. But we get the message. He's there with his finger, he's looking down on his people, and he's giving them an outcome, and none of them are happy about it. So we receive this further insight into the character of King Solomon through this. Remember, King Solomon started off really wise, but after he intermarried, it tells you that he changed. He started worshipping foreign idols and all those influences. So his character changed. So his success during his reign had come at a cost. He had imposed heavy taxes on his people. The workers from the tribes of Ephraim, remember that? He imposed heavy taxes on his people. So a lot more gold than this piece here. And he had imposed those taxes. The workers from the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh, who had been building on the eastern side of Jerusalem, had suffered under the yoke of harsh labour and these whips. So these threats from Rehoboam were not going to earn any loyalty. So he's not going to win them over through these threats. So the king did not listen to the people. He was determined not to be overshadowed by his father. Anyone make a wrong decision in their life because their father came before them and they want to prove themselves that they're capable? So this is another one of these situations. So they shouted in 1 Kings chapter 12 verse 16, what share do we have in David? What part in Jesse's sons? To your tents, O Israel, look after your own house, O David. As their future king, Rehoboam made it clear that he was not going to serve his people under the constitution originally written down by the prophet Samuel, which again I mentioned before is found in 1 Samuel chapter 10 verse 25. So they did have a constitution. The people of Israel rejected Rehoboam and began to disperse. So the Bible tells us in verse 18 of 1 Kings chapter 12, King Rehoboam sent out Adoniram, who was in charge of forced labour, but all Israel stoned him to death. King Rehoboam, however, managed to get into his chariot and escape to Jerusalem. So that went well. He sent him out to brutalise his people, but nobody else was listening. And so they just turned around and stoned Adoniram to death. So these events fulfill the word of the Lord that Ahiah, the prophet from Shiloh, spoke to Jeroboam Son of Nabat in 1 Kings chapter 12 verse 15. Solomon had forsaken God. Now Solomon's son Rehoboam forsook his people. And so we see this exchange in the relationship. Israel rebelled and Rehoboam fled to Jerusalem. the 10 assembled tribes of the north called Jeroboam forward, and they sent him to fulfill the word of the Lord given by the prophet Ahiah of Shiloh. They made Jeroboam son of Nabat from the tribe of Ephraim their king. The new breakaway kingdom retained the name the Kingdom of Israel, but it was also known as Samaria, Ephraim, or the Northern Kingdom. So all of these titles were put to this kingdom. So here's a map. I've put this up on a previous lesson, but this shows you the divide of the territory. The kingdom of Judah, the tribe of Judah, was the largest landholding of any of the tribes. In the middle of it used to be Simeon. It was absorbed, and so now all that's left is one tribe, and all of the other 10 tribes are here. Here's Shechem, here's Samaria. It's known as the Northern Kingdom. It's known as Samaria. It's known as the Kingdom of Israel, and it's also known as Ephraim because their ruler came from Ephraim. Okay, so hence all the connections there. So when the 10 northern tribes formed the Kingdom of Israel under Jeroboam's rule, and Rehoboam returned to Jerusalem to rule over the Kingdom of Judah, as I mentioned, what happened to the tribe of Simeon? So I will explain it quickly again. The Bible tells us that just before the death of Jacob, many years earlier, he said to his sons from whom the 12 tribes of Israel would come, in Genesis 49 verse 1. And I keep going back to this because this is actually where it all happened. What we're seeing now in the book of Kings, even though you don't perhaps look at it this way, is we're seeing the fulfillment of some of the prophetic words that were given by Jacob long before they were in the land here. And he said, "Gather around so I can tell you what will happen to you in days to come." Jacob gave his blessing to all of them except 2. I challenge you with that question. Which 2 tribes did Jacob not bless? There was 2 tribes, or 2 brothers at that time. They were the heads of the tribes. Sorry? The eldest, whose name was? We've just mentioned it. Simeon. So yes, well done. And who was the other tribe? No, it wasn't Reuben.
Wasn't Benjamin because he was the youngest?
Who else didn't get an inheritance? Which tribe didn't get an inheritance?
Dan.
No. Wasn't Dan?
I'm just going through it.
Anyone online? Which tribe out of the original brothers didn't get an inheritance, a land inheritance?
Would it have been Joseph?
No.
No, because... okay.
It was Levi. Okay? The Levites became the priesthood. They were never given any land. So Jacob didn't give his blessing to Simeon and Levi. He cursed them because they were cruel and treacherous when they destroyed the tribe of... Anyone remember?
Yeah.
The Shechemites. Remember when they came there? The 2 brothers slaughtered all of them. So this all goes back to this. There's a consequence for the actions, and sometimes it happens many, many, many years later. So we find that he cursed them because they were cruel and treacherous when they destroyed the tribe of Shechemites after their sister Dinah was raped by the chief's son. You can read about that if you want to refresh your memory in Genesis chapter 34. So there was a consequence for this. They used their swords in anger as weapons of violence to hurt others rather than weapons of defense. Simeon's anger was evil and cruel, and Jacob cursed them. It says in Genesis 49 verses 5 to 7, Simeon and Levi are brothers. Their swords are weapons of violence. So this is the curse. Cursed be their anger so fierce and their fury so cruel. I will scatter them in Jacob and disperse them in Israel. And so what happened? Simeon, as I mentioned, was a tribe that was here. When they first left, when they got the land inheritance, they joined up with the people from Judah. They were going to fight all of the Canaanites and the Philistines to obtain their land. And the Simeon, people of Simeon, the Simeonites, were absorbed into the tribe of Judah, and some of them actually moved throughout the rest of the land. So in other words, they became no longer an independent tribe. The region that they actually inherited was around Beersheba, etc., in the Negev. I've been there. It's really barren. there's not much there. It's all desert, most of it, and so it wasn't very inhabitable land. So when they were cursed, they were not only given pretty much uninhabitable land, but they left it. And so this prophecy that says that they will be scattered and dispersed is exactly what happened. What about the Levites? Scattered and dispersed. How were they scattered and dispersed? They were the priesthood, were they not? What happened to the tribe of the Levites? Did they all stay together? No. Did they stay in one city? No. So what happened to them? What does the Bible tell us? We have done this. They were 40 priestly cities throughout the kingdom of Israel. And so their body of people was split up between 40 locations. And so they were scattered and dispersed. Even though they were there to do the Lord's work or to serve in the priestly functions of the temples and the altars, etc., they were scattered. In other words, they were no longer a body of people together, and they were no longer a body of people who would inherit the land. And so we see at this point in time and earlier that the prophecy that Jacob put over these two tribes actually came to fruition. So the descendants of Levi, as I said, were never allotted any land of inheritance to call their own, but they were given the priestly cities. However, they never owned any of it. They just got to use it. The descendants of Simeon were also the smallest in number of all the tribes of Israel. You can look that up in the book of Numbers, chapter 26, verse 14. When they were counted before entering the land of Canaan. As I said, they were allotted land within the territory of Judah, as I mentioned, and that's in Joshua 19, verses 1 to 9. And they found it inadequate as their flocks increased. As I said, it's very barren and arid there. So they sought pasture elsewhere, so they dispersed, and they scattered, so the prophecy of Jacob was fulfilled. The consequence of this, for today's lesson, we're looking at Rehoboam, was when Rehoboam formed the kingdom of Judah, the territory of Simeon was already part of his territory. And when the descendants of Simeon had been dispersed throughout Israel, he no longer had to take them into consideration. So when the tribes are separated, there was 10 to the north, but there's actually only one left to the south. Remember, we started with 12 tribes of Israel with the sons. Joseph had 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. They became allotted the land. The Levites' curse mean they didn't get the land. So in fact, there's actually 13 in total at this point in time. And then we find out now that the Simeonites have been dispersed. So in reality, at this point in history, there's actually only 11 tribes split up between Ephraim and Manasseh. But if we actually look at the time of Joseph, there's actually only 10 tribes in the land itself. Okay? And so we see what's actually happening to them as time goes by. So going back to the story, Rehoboam had his commander of the labour, Adoniram, beg your pardon. He was stoned to death. And so what did Rehoboam do? He jumped in his chariot and he fled. So he was... his heart, you can imagine after what just happened, would have been racing, and he would have been scared, but at the same time would have been pretty angry, because here he was on the cusp of becoming the king over all of Israel, and suddenly he realised he's not going to get it. And so he's scared of being killed. At the same time, he's angry for what they did. So he believed that he was next if he hadn't have escaped. So as he raced southwards through the hill country back to Jerusalem, he would have been becoming very angry as he thought about his birthright slipping through his fingers. In spite of everything, though, he was still the son of King Solomon, and he was determined that he should be the next king to rule over all of Israel. So arriving back in Jerusalem, he mustered some able-bodied men from the house of Judah and the house of Benjamin. Messengers. Now Benjamin was on just here. There's just a very small group of people here. So there's some of those people there. So it says that he's mustered some of those people as well. Messengers were sent out to the cities, towns and villages, and an army of 180,000 men were raised. He intended making war against the house of Israel to regain control, but the Lord sent a man of God called Shemaiah to give him a word. Shemaiah is spelled Shemaiah. The prophet told Rehoboam and the men not to fight against their own people, and God ordered them in verse 24 of 1 Kings chapter 12, "Go home every one of you, for this is my doing." So finally they have a direct word from God, and he says go home. He's saying it's because of him that this is happening to them. They obeyed and went home, and Rehoboam had to reconcile to understand that. In verse 20 of 1 Kings chapter 12 it says, "Only the tribe of Judah remained loyal to the house of David." So in other words, they were separated from all the other tribes at this point. Okay, so during the latter period of Judges, when Israel was subject to the tyranny of many neighbouring kingdoms, the whole region of the Middle East was unstable. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background, because as we go forwards in the Bible, the region that they're actually situated in doesn't stay the same. Right? There's other kingdoms coming and going, people become powerful, they attack one another, etc. And so what happens as we go through this journey is I'm going to keep introducing those who are around them who will come to affect them at a future point. Then you'll know who they are. When we read the Bible, we suddenly come up and we're reading away, and I'm just going to touch on this fellow, and suddenly there's King King Rezon from Aram Damascus, and you think, who is he? Where is Aram Damascus? And so I'm going to give you the startup as I go along of each and every person as we come along them, so you know who they are. So when they become integrated into the biblical story, you'll know the background and why it's actually happening. So going back to the latter period of Judges, the Middle East was deemed to be very unstable. The treaties between old empires had come to an end, and the self-satisfied rulers had become weak. And there was also a scarcity of food at this time from drought-affected harvest failure that played in the hands of a new people called the Aramaians. Although little records exist, they are a Semitic-speaking people, so that tells you that they're descended from Shem. Okay, so this is one of Noah's sons. Remember, the three sons went into different regions. So they were Semitic people, speaking people, so they're the same as the Jewish people today. And they secured a foothold in the city of Haran, where Abraham's father lived. It was a trading town. Now it's either Aram, son of Nahor, which is the brother of Abraham, or his grandson Aram Naharaim, who is considered to be the ancestor of all Aramaeans. So does anyone know where Aramea is? I do have a map behind me, so if you do look, you can cheat. It's here. The Assyrian Empire is further to the north. There's all these Aramaean tribes up here, but there was this area which we're about to explain, which became a kingdom of Aram Damascus. There's Damascus itself. We know it as Syria today. And so this is the region. So this area here, which is right on the boundary of Israel, starts to develop and becoming a power to itself. So they're going to become a threat as time goes by. It says that the Aramaeans were a confederation of tribes, and they grew steadily in number and power until when the existing nations began to crumble at the end of the 13th century BC, they took advantage of the confusion to raid and infiltrate the northern edges of Syria. And they gradually migrated throughout the region. They took control of many cities. Some maintained the previous culture, whilst others became wholly Aramaean. And so we see here that there's these two areas, here and up here, but they're all descended from the same people. The city-state, remember we mentioned about city-states? So they're a city with a fortress wall. They have their grazing and farming around them. Of Demise had been the stronghold of a tribe called the Amru. So notice how we've called them Aram Damascus, capitals Damascus, so Dama, this name. Demise was actually a city-state. So it's been there for a long time. They're a tribe of Amorite people who had grown and settled there during the time of Abraham. But when the old empires came to an end, the Sea Peoples, now the Sea Peoples are the people who became known as the Philistines down here in Philistia. They too went over there from the Greek Isles of the Aegean Sea, and they took advantage of the regional instability to sack and destroy many other places. The Amorite people and their city Demise were victim to this, and after the Sea Peoples took what they wanted, they left a depleted population and a destroyed city behind. It was into this vacuum during the reign of King David, in a city located on a major trade route in a fertile, well-watered plain, that a young officer called Rezon, R-E-Z-O-N, led a band of rebels, and he established himself, and he had fled from his master, King Hadadezer of Zobah, when he was fighting in a losing battle against King David. So this goes back into David's time. The depleted Amorite population of Damascus soon found themselves controlled by this fellow Rezon, and as he grew in power, he not only came to rule their city, but he also came to unite all the Aramaians in the region into one kingdom, hence this region here. Located to the northeast of Israel, Damas became known as Damascus, and the first king of Aram, Rezon the first, or Hezion, is alternately known. You can find his name in 1 Kings chapter 15, verse 18. So he suddenly appears in your Bible, hence why I'm giving you the background. He ruled this new kingdom of Aram Damascus from there. Now these Arameans, they filtered further down into Babylonia and Assyria, and they effectively destroyed the former Assyrian Empire. Now the Assyrian Empire will resurge. This is not the Assyrian Empire most of us know from the Bible. This is the first Assyrian Empire. There was two eras of them. This was the political landscape surrounding the people of Israel when their kingdom was torn into two. When Rehoboam became king of Judah and Jeroboam became king of Israel, both Aram Damascus and Assyria received new kings. And now elderly King Rezon I of Aram Damascus died, and his son, called Tabrimon, Tabrimon, ascended the throne, and funnily enough, his name is in the Bible in 1 Kings 15:18. And so he ascended the throne whilst the Assyrian king called Ashur-dan II had just replaced his father Tiglath-Pileser II a few years earlier in 935 BC. So the picture is there's a change of guard happening in the regions around them. They're young kings, and young kings are known to like to go out to raid and go to war. So Solomon's father-in-law, Pharaoh Shishak, who we've already introduced earlier, of Lower Egypt, died during the reign of Solomon in 960 BC, and he was replaced by another pharaoh who was called Osorkon II, O-S-O-R-K-O-N. He's not named in the Bible, but he's certainly named in history. By the time Rehoboam became king of Judah and Jeroboam became king of Israel in 931 BC, Pharaoh Osorkon II had united Egypt by appointing one of his own sons to be a high priest at Amun in Thebes in Upper Egypt. And so the long and short of it is there's a new force here and down here in Egypt, which was formerly divided when Shishak gave his daughter to Solomon to marry. It's now united. So what we're telling you is that they're on the up. These two to the north and to the east, and down to the south and to the west, both of those nations are now starting to grow in power. Now the new king of Israel, Jeroboam I, fortified Shechem as his capital in the north, but believed the people of Israel would give their allegiance to Rehoboam and kill him if they were to go to Jerusalem to offer their sacrifices to the Lord. Of course, they were obliged to go to the Temple of Jerusalem. So seeking advice once again, Jeroboam decided that he would form, what did he form? 2 golden calves. And he said to his people in 1 Kings chapter 12 verse 28, "It is too much for you to go to Jerusalem. Here are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." And when you go to Israel today, and you go up to Tel Dan, which is the tribe of Dan right at the northern border, near Mount Hermon on the border with Lebanon and Syria today, there's all these plaques. And so one's written in Hebrew and the other's written in English. So this is a photograph of a section that I actually took. And it talks about this very scripture where it says, "And the king made 2 calves of gold, and he set one in Bethel, the house of God, and the other put he in Dan." And so what we find, I'll just go back to the map, is that here one golden calf put, and up here the other golden calf put. So the northern boundary and the southern boundary, they put a golden calf at either side. And Jeroboam, their king, said, "These are your God." Why do you think he formed an idol as a calf? And he could have made a bird, he could have made an animal of any sort, an object. It's always a calf. Why do you think he formed a calf? King Jeroboam.
It becomes from Egypt.
Right. So what was worshipped in Egypt?
The cow.
The cow. Right. It's the same problem, wasn't it, at Mount Sinai? When Moses went up the mount, what did they form? Golden calf. So in other words, they were influenced by the worship from Egypt. Jeroboam, of course, had run down to Egypt to hide from King Solomon. So he comes back and he has this brilliant idea. I know, I'll be original, I'll form a golden calf. And so he builds these 2 golden calves. So he set up an altar in a high place for one of the golden calves at Dan in the northern extremity of his kingdom, and the other he set up at Bethel in the southern extremity of his kingdom. He also built many other shrines throughout the kingdom in various high places. Overlooking the Levites, he appointed many different kinds of people to serve as priests. So in other words, he didn't get rid of the Levites, but he instituted a new priesthood and a new form of worship. He then instituted a festival to fall on the 15th day of the 8th month of every year to offer sacrifices on his altars, like the festival for the feast of... What's that date? When do they go to Jerusalem to bring their annual sacrifice? It's called the festival or the feast of the tabernacles, or the festival of booths. And so he put it on exactly the same day. So in other words, he's saying you don't need to go there because we've got our own thing happening here. And thus they don't need to go to the temple of Jerusalem in Judah. So when this day came about the first time, Jeroboam led by example, and he offered sacrifice on the altar at Bethel, and in this way he became renowned as the man who made Israel sin. Now, I've shown you some pictures and film footage on a previous lesson, but this is another picture from another angle. So I'm actually standing on the side of the altar here, which is where all of the priests' storerooms are. And I'm just going to put on a video clip in a minute. This is the altar. So this is the actual altar that he built. This is one of the 2. It's still there. We mentioned the dimensions, I believe, if I remember correctly. One is about 9 meters long. So it's a vastly huge altar. It was made out of wood. It was covered in copper. And then you had all of these, this wall surrounding it to enclose it here. And so it was a horned altar, so he replicated the altar that was what God required. And so he sort of hung on to lots of things, but he just changed what the object of what they were worshipping. So I'm just going to go to a short video. And this is at this place, and I'll show you a little bit more. You haven't seen this one before.
Yeah, again, still at the Tel Dan altar. Another location, I'm sort of in a room, like sets of rooms off to the side. You sort of see what was a doorway there, the second room. I'm standing in one room. There's like spin around, there's the stairs, the wall.
So this is the high place. This is the priest's high place.
Across there's the altar over there. So it's like a chamber,
The altar.
off the side. Perhaps the place where the priest resided, or used as storage and then go back around to the front gate. And the plaque here remembers the scripture from Leviticus, which says, "And he shall take a censer full of burning coals of fire from off the altar." And the nice picture there. So this room, there's some information there. It says, This room, the altar chamber, originally contained an altar and the shovels whose replicas are on display. Okay. Wow, so this is the actual storage room where they kept all the implements. In fact, the altar itself, where they found it. So that's extraordinary. There it is set up over there.
Okay. So I'm filming as I'm walking and talking there, and so I discovered as I was walking that it was actually what I said it was. And so those rooms on the side held all the priestly implements. So you can sort of see the organisation of it. They had the stairs going up to what they call the high place. So when you read in the Bible, it says they built altars and high places. They were two different things. So the high place is where it was like a building. It was a place where they went to actually worship, and the altar was a place where they would sacrifice. So if you think about the Temple of Jerusalem, you had the temple itself with the Holy of Holies inside, and then out the front of it you had the actual altar. So they're two separate things. So they were both built. So this gives you a picture. What you've just seen there lets you see, when you read the Bible back in these times, exactly what was actually being built. You were seeing altars, high places, rooms on the side with the priestly implements, and of course they had their priesthoods, and they had temple prostitution in these places as well. So the background, as we mentioned, in ancient Egypt, bull cults were prevalent. Sacred bulls were identified by specific markings, and they were actually believed to be reincarnated gods. Once identified, they were housed in plush quarters and given the best food and provided with a harem of the best cows. After living extraordinary quality of life when they died, they were mummified and buried with full honour, like Egyptian pharaohs, in a stone sarcophagi. And so you can go to Egypt and you can see these today. I do have pictures. I'm sorry I don't have any available for the lesson tonight. But basically they mummified these animals. The most famous bull cult was called Apis, who, symbolising fertility and strength in war, was paraded through the streets in what was known as the Festival of the Apis Bull, that lasted for 7 days. Now, when the Israelites had Aaron form the golden calf to worship at Mount Sinai, and now when Jeroboam formed 2 golden calves and said, "Here are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt," it is considered that the Apis bull was the god familiar to the Israelites. And so take note of that scripture. He actually says, "Who brought you up out of Egypt." He actually connects his people as coming from Egypt with the actual gods that they left behind. And so there's your connection. That's what the golden calf is. And so they believe it's what they call the Apis bull, which is their primary deity amongst all of the bulls there. So there's a little bit of background why the golden calf keeps coming up in the Bible. Now, a man of God who came from the tribe of Judah went to Bethel when King Jeroboam I was standing next to the altar to make an offering. And he cried out in 1 Kings chapter 13, verses 2 to 3, we're going to read. And he said, "O altar, altar, this is what the Lord says. A son named Josiah will be born into the house of David. On you he will sacrifice the priests of the high places who now make offerings here, and human bones will be burned on you." That same day the man of God gave a sign. "This is the sign the Lord has declared. The altar will be split apart, and the ashes on it will be poured out." And so we find as soon as King Jeroboam separated from God, God sent a dire warning through a person to let them all know what was going to happen in the future. The King Jeroboam stretched out his hand from the altar and told those in attendance in 1 Kings verse 4 of chapter 13, "Seize him." But the hand he stretched out toward the man shriveled up so that he could not pull it back. Does this sound familiar? The hand shriveled up. Remember one of the signs that was given to Moses when he went to the Pharaoh was about the hand shriveling up and being coated in the white flakes. "Seize him," but the hand he stretched out toward the man shriveled up so he could not pull it back. The altar then split as prophesied, and the ashes poured out. King Jeroboam I had no recourse but to ask the man of God to intercede with the Lord so that his hand could be restored. So an intercessory prayer was given and the Lord restored the hand of the king. You would think that would be enough to make someone change their actions, would you not? Your hand has shriveled up and then it came back upon prayer to God. But astonishingly, this did not stop the king in his tracks. He continued with his evil ways and consecrated anyone who wanted to become a priest for any of the high places. Now notice this, he as the king is consecrating priests. He doesn't have the right to consecrate a priest. A godly priest is not consecrated by man. And so we see another sin occurring here in that very process. As this was happening, Abiah, the son of the king, became ill. So King Jeroboam I sent his wife in disguise to see the prophet Ahiah of Shiloh, who first told him he would be king of the 10 northern tribes of Israel. Ahiah of Shiloh had become blind with age, but the Lord forewarned him of the pending visit. Although pretending to be someone else, as the king's wife approached the door of the prophet, he said in 1 Kings chapter 14 now, verses 6 to 9, "Come in, wife of Jeroboam. Why this pretense? I have been sent to you with bad news. Go, tell Jeroboam that this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says." Funny, isn't it? When you start reading this now, you hear these words like the God of Israel. He's saying not your God, the God of Israel. He's making a very strong statement here. He says, "I raised you up from among the people and made you a leader over my people Israel. I tore the kingdom from the house of David and gave it to you. But you have not been like my servant David. You have done more evil than all who lived before you. You have made for yourself other gods, idols made of metal. You have provoked me to anger." The prophet went on to inform her that her son would die when she returned home, that no male descendant of King Jeroboam I will survive, and that the Lord will strike the kingdom of Israel so severely that in verse 15 it says, "It will be like a reed swaying in the water. He will uproot Israel from this good land that he gave to their forefathers and scatter them beyond the river." So a lot of really dire warnings coming through here. But we also find here that we see that there's this punishment where no male descendant. So as you read your Bible, and as I continue to teach through this, you'll see that this prophetic word comes true with every single generation. So the prophet Ahiah of Shiloh reveals how the people from the 10 northern tribes of Israel will be removed from the land given to them by their forefathers, the land received from the promise of God's covenant. The word of the Lord says he will scatter them beyond the river. What river do you think that is? What was the river, the boundary that was given in the covenant that God gave to Abraham originally and all the way through?
Jordan.
No. What's the river? The Bible often talks about. So the word Hebrew, right, itself, the language, right, means the other side or the other side of the river, right? It's what Abraham was originally called. He spoke Hebrew. Why? Because he was from the other side. The other side of what? The other side of the Euphrates River. So the Euphrates River, and the reason for this reference is because if you go there today, the river, because it meanders, has actually changed. The ancient city of where we first started, is actually now on the opposite side of the river to when it was during the time of Abraham. So the city of where Abraham was called out from, was on the other side of the Euphrates River when it was originally built. And so this is what it means. It's reference right back to Abraham from the other side of the river. The word Hebrew, the language itself, means that. So the Euphrates River, the same river that Abraham crossed over to come to the land of Canaan, is what we're talking about. So the Lord reveals through Ahiah the future demise of the northern kingdom of Israel. And in 1 Kings chapter 14 verse 16, he says, "And he will give Israel up because of the sins Jeroboam has committed and has caused Israel to commit." So here we are, we've just started. We've got the north and the south kingdoms that have just been formed. They've just been formed. As soon as they're formed, Jeroboam puts the altars and the high places here. He tells them they no longer need to go to Jerusalem. And what's happening? He's been told that none of his descendants will survive their lives, and he's been told that the whole kingdom is going to be taken from him, and he's only just starting. Because instead of honouring what God said to him, he's once again, like all those others, has said, no, this is my kingdom, not God's kingdom. All right? God said, you got this because of me, and now he's sinned straight away. And this is the demise of the northern kingdom, right in the beginning. So despite dismembering the nation of Israel for the sin of Solomon, and despite the reckless actions of both new kings, God protects the house of David, for from it is the promise of the covenant to be fulfilled. That, of course, is the future Messiah, Jesus. In 1 Kings chapter 11, so just going back a couple of chapters, verse 36, he said, I will give one tribe to his son Rehoboam, so that David, my servant, may always have a lamp before me in Jerusalem, the city where I chose to put my name. So that's his instruction. He will always keep it there despite what's happened. So again, 1 Kings 11, verse 36. So despite losing the 10 northern tribes of Israel, Rehoboam too protects the house of David, and he fortifies cities for defence throughout Judah and this area just above it where the tribe of Benjamin is. The priests and Levites from the north abandoned their pasture lands and property and come to Jerusalem and Judah because King Jeroboam I rejected them for being priests of the Lord. So those priests now don't stay in the land. So all those priestly cities, a whole pile of them now moved down to the south. And those from amongst the people of the northern tribes who sought the Lord and followed the Levites to Jerusalem to offer their sacrifices. So in other words, not everybody stayed there. Some people said, no, I'm not having this. We're going to Jerusalem. So in 2 Chronicles, chapter 11, verse 17, so 2 Chronicles is the book that aligns from the Babylonian exile with the first book of Kings. So we go back and forth. So we're going to be doing a little bit of 2 Chronicles now. So 2 Chronicles, chapter 11, verse 17, says, they strengthened the kingdom of Judah and supported Rehoboam, son of Solomon, 3 years, walking the ways of David and Solomon during this time. So for 3 years, it's telling us, once King Rehoboam realised that he'd lost the northern kingdom, he basically went home and he behaved. He became a man of God, and he continued to fortify what was left to him. Rehoboam married Mahalath, the daughter of his uncle Jeremoth, and after fathering 3 sons who were named Shush, Shemariah, and Zaham, he then married Maacah, the daughter of Absalom, and fathered another 4 sons, Abiah, Attai, Ziza, and Shelomith. So Absalom was the daughter of Maacah, and Maacah is one of the wives of King David. Okay, so we're now 3 generations along. In all, Rehoboam had 18 wives and 60 concubines who bore 28 sons and 60 daughters. So he's not a patch on his father, but he's doing okay. He's still got lots of wives and lots of concubines and kids. But he loved Maacah the most and appointed her son Abiah, the crown prince or the chief prince, to become the future king. His other sons, Rehoboam, dispersed throughout Judah and Benjamin to all the fortified cities. By giving them abundant provisions, many wives, and a post to command, this prevented any challenge for power occurring from within their midst. And so we find here that Abiah is to be the next king of Israel. If you look on your genealogical list for Jesus, you'll find that he is the next name. So unfortunately, after establishing his kingship and becoming strong, Rehoboam and his people abandoned the law of the Lord. And so in the background I mentioned before, and I'm just going to keep checking in on these to keep you in knowledge of what's going on. This Pharaoh who I mentioned, who changed from Shishak to a Sargon, he died early in the reign of King Rehoboam in 928 BC. And so he was succeeded by a Pharaoh, another Shishak, but this was Shishak III. There was 6 Shishaks. Okay? So by the time Rehoboam reigns the kingdom of Judah for 5 years, the new Pharaoh, Shishak, will attack the kingdom of Judah. And so this is again why we keep you in the loop, because this person is going to come and attack. It's not the same Shishak that was there during the time of King Solomon. So once Shishak gave his daughter to marry King Solomon, the next Shishak is actually 2 pharaohs after. There was this other fellow, a Sorkon, that was there in between, who once again brought the 2 halves of Egypt back together, and then he named his son Shishak. So we find here again in the Bible, if we don't read the history and learn it, you'll find that you read the Bible, you assume it's the same person, but if you look at how many years that happened between the two, you realise it's not possible, especially with Egyptian pharaohs, because they don't have long terms of rule. And so we're on Shishak the third. Okay, so after returning to Jerusalem and building the elaborate defences to fortify his cities in Judah, King Rehoboam had readied his kingdom against any attack. But after being obedient to God for 3 years, he dove deep into the worship of false gods, and he too began to build high places of worship with sacred stones and Asherah poles on every high hill and under every spreading tree. So in 1 Kings chapter 14, verses 23 to 24, we read about this. It says, "There were even male shrine prostitutes in the land. The people engaged in all the detestable practices of the nations the Lord had driven out before the Israelites." And so we see a rebound, don't we? Because here's King Solomon, his father, and he built all of these altars. So Rehoboam comes along, he gets the consequences of it, he loses the northern kingdom, he comes back home and he does the right thing for 3 years. Right? And then suddenly he follows the lead of his father. He's now married many wives as well, and suddenly he's now building for them as well. And so God warned them, didn't they, before they went into the land originally, do not intermarry. It wasn't because the women were women, it was because what they believed was different and they didn't worship God. And so the warning keeps coming through. So this keeps rolling through the whole biblical story during the period of Kings. So because Rehoboam had led his people to be unfaithful, the Lord's wrath was unleashed once again. It says in 2 Chronicles chapter 12, verses 2 to 4, Shishak, king of Egypt, attacked Jerusalem in the 5th year of King Rehoboam. So again, this is Shishak the third. With 1,200 chariots and 60,000 horsemen, hear that, 60,000 horsemen, and the innumerable troops of Libyans, Sukkites and Cushites that came with him from Egypt, he captured the fortified cities of Judah and came as far as Jerusalem. So again, 2 Chronicles chapter 12, verses 2 to 4. And so this is why I keep giving you some history along the way. I'm sorry it's historical, but we can't do it without it. And so we find here that he's actually reformed under a Sorkon, Egypt, into a united nation, and now those nations that are around them have allied with them to actually go up against other nations. And so from the southwest, as I was mentioning before, we've got these forces coming at them, and at Aram, Damascus up at the top, they've got these forces against the other side. And so we see the security of this nation falling apart. Because remember, during the time of King Solomon, there was nobody who came against them. So within 5 years, they're now being attacked by the Egyptians. And they come all the way as far as Jerusalem. What would you say? There's historical evidence that actually confirms this very thing, because there is. There's a temple which is in Egypt. I'll just put this picture up. And this is a picture of the wall of this temple. On this wall, you can see the image of the Pharaoh carved in here. And along these are what are known as cartouches. Okay? And each of these cartouches has a different inscription on each of them. I know this is a tough question. Anyone know what they are, what they represent? Anyone ever learnt anything about this? So let me tell you. This large relief is in the Temple of Karnak in Egypt. And it's identified with Pharaoh Shishak. Right, next to his engraved image, all of these cartouches, there's actually 150 of them in total that are engraved on the walls next to him. Those cartouches represent the conquered towns and people in both Israel and Judah. And so in the Temple of Karnak, during the time of Shishak, he came back after he conquered, because that's what the rulers do, and he carved in the names of all of these places which he overcame during this time. So what we're saying here something I love to do. There's historical evidence for the truth of the Bible, which you can go to Egypt to see today. Okay, so this event really happened. So with Lower and Upper Egypt unified into one powerful nation, Pharaoh Shishak, he's also known as Sheshonk, so it depends on the language, the third, was able to muster the Libyans from Lower Egypt, the Sukkites, which are thought to be people from the Arabian Gulf, the western shore of the Arabian Gulf, and the Cushites, which is what we know as Ethiopia today, from Upper Egypt. In 926 BC, King Rehoboam had shut himself inside the walls of Jerusalem as news reached him from the southernmost cities of Judah, telling of their defeat at the hands of a mighty Egyptian army. The leaders of Judah had fled to and come to Jerusalem for fear of Pharaoh Shishak. King Rehoboam was holding court with the leaders when the prophet Shemaiah was ushered into the hall of justice. The king greeted the prophet, who then said to him in 2 Chronicles chapter 12, verse 5 to 6, "This is what the Lord says. You have abandoned me. Therefore I now abandon you to Shishak." The leaders of Israel and the king finally humbled themselves and said to the Lord is just. In other words, they acknowledged their sin. So what this tells you, we see a situation happening here where the Lord brought in an army against his own people. This is a precursor for what's going to happen again and again and again. God uses other people to come against his own people when they sin. How does that make you feel? Right?
Is it because he can't punish them directly, because due to the covenant he's got with them?
Any thoughts? That's a good question. God punishes. Remember the cycle that I gave you, where we have sin and then punishment.
Restoration.
Right? We have the restoration, right? But before the restoration, there's rescue. There's those 4 stages, and it happens all the way through this period of the Bible. Right? When Jesus came, the same happened. It was our sin, right? He came and paid the price. He was punished. He rescued us and restored us back to the Father. The same cycle happens. And so we see here that God is using earthly people to come against his own people to punish them. Okay? You have to realise that our God, our Father, is in heaven. We live on the earth. We're physical people in a physical world, and he uses physical means for everything. And as we've journeyed through the Bible, we learn about, for example, the hornets that flushed out the giants so his people could win. Right? The fact that the cliffs would fall over so the water would stop flowing in the Jordan so his people could cross to Jericho. There's all these things that happen of a physical nature in this world. They require physical events to happen. And so God uses physical means, and he brings armies against his own people. People against people. Okay? But what he's doing is he's bringing ungodly people against ungodly people, because his people are no longer following him. So he uses people like them to punish them. They're no different at this point in time. And so the king here, Rehoboam, says the Lord is just. He acknowledges that they've abandoned him, and so he now abandons them to this raider Shishak. So Rehoboam and the leaders knew what they had done. They abandoned the law of the Lord to engage in all the detestable practices that the Lord had driven out. Now when Pharaoh Shishak from Egypt attacked, all their defences were as nothing without the presence of the Lord to protect them. And so this tells you that the presence of the Lord is a thing as well. Right? Without God's covering and God's protection, events come against his people. So guilty before God, King Rehoboam experienced the kind of shame that could only bring humility. He looked around at his leaders there in the hall of justice at his palace. He could see that they too were remorseful. Fear crept in amongst them, even with the recently completed fortification works. How on earth were they going to stand against such a vast enemy? So when the Lord saw Rehoboam and the leaders humble themselves, he showed his mercy towards them when he told the prophet Shemaiah he would not totally destroy them. And so here's Rehoboam. He's got the remnant left after God separated the kingdom. And now he's been told that he's going to get punished, but he's not going to get everything totally destroyed. And what was the thing that was spared? Of course it was God's own city, Jerusalem. So Jerusalem will be spared, but they will become subject to Pharaoh Shishak, so that they may learn the difference between serving me and serving the kings of other lands. 2 Chronicles 12:8. So that's your answer there for your question. It actually says, so they may learn the difference between serving me and serving the kings of other lands. So when we serve foreign gods or foreign kings, he will use them against you, like for like. So with 1,200 chariots and 60,000 horsemen, followed by innumerable troops, the Egyptians, led by Pharaoh Shishak, rolled over the land of Judah like a wave. In 2 Chronicles, chapter 12, verse 9, so we're sort of staying in 2 Chronicles at this point, almost finished. When Shishak, king of Egypt, attacked Jerusalem, so verse 9, 2 Chronicles chapter 12, he carried off the treasures of the temple of the Lord and the treasures of the royal palace. He took everything, including the gold shields Solomon made. And so we see something really dire happen here. Something that's so precious has actually been invaded. So in other words, they didn't destroy Jerusalem, but they took the wealth out of it. So when the Egyptians arrived at the gates of Jerusalem, King Rehoboam knew it was futile to resist. He understood that this was actually the consequence of the Lord's wrath, because the Lord told him through the prophet. And so what does he do? He stood aside. He stood aside and let Pharaoh Shishak and his men strip the house of the Lord and the palace of the forest of Lebanon. Right? We were talking about this stuff, and we're talking about this stuff. So that's what they took. Loads of gold and silver, all the wealthy things, all the implements out of the temples and the palace. So as a boy, he had watched his father as he built the temple and the palace. And now he watched in sorrow as his father's blessing turned into a curse. The vast measure was taken away in one quick moment. As if this wasn't humiliating enough, the Pharaoh claimed sovereignty over his defeat, and he was forced to submit his kingdom as a vassal state of Egypt. If you're not aware of that word, if you ever hear the word vassal, a vassal is someone who is a servant of another. Right? So in the Bible, when he becomes a vassal state of Egypt, that means they still operate as an autonomous state, but they have to pay tribute, which is taxes. So in other words, they can get on with day-to-day life. The Egyptians aren't interested in actually being there, but they want to get their money. So spared at the feet of a foreign invader, Rehoboam returned to worshipping the Lord. Once the Pharaoh withdrew with his armies, new bronze shields were made to replace the gold ones, and Rehoboam's guard to guard the entrance to his palace and escort him to the temple used them. So the shields were being used, the gold ones weren't being used. The Lord turned his anger from Rehoboam, and some good returned to the land of Judah. However, it says in 2 Chronicles chapter 12 verse 15, there was continual warfare between Rehoboam and Jeroboam. So in other words, things were not good domestically. A little bit more history before we wrap up. In the 8th year of Pharaoh Shishak III's reign, Egypt actually split again. Inner turmoil saw a high priest called the Sheikhan again rule Upper Egypt from Thebes, whilst Pharaoh Shishak III continued to rule Lower Egypt from Tanis. As Egypt again fractured into two in 920 BC, the kingdom of Judah returned to self-determination as an independent sovereign nation. And so, again, understanding that history, the kingdom of Judah became its own, not just autonomous state in the sense of governance, but it actually became its own kingdom again, and were no longer paying taxes to Egypt at this point in time. So King Rehoboam ruled over the kingdom of Judah for 17 years until he died in 915 BC at the age of 56. He joined his ancestors buried in the city of David. His reign fulfilled the prophecy of the Lord, and the united kingdom of Israel was forever torn apart. Rehoboam led his people to be obedient to God and his laws for just 3 years before abandoning him. Suffering God's wrath for his choices, The land of Judah had all of its cities captured by the Egyptians in the 5th year of reign, whilst the land of Benjamin was left untouched. Rehoboam, and why? Because they didn't go past Jerusalem. Rehoboam did, however, learn from this experience, and whilst being forced to become the subject of Pharaoh Shishak for 6 years, he remained faithful to God until he once again ruled an independent kingdom of Judah for a further 6 years. Rehoboam did bring up his son Abiah, the next in line to be king of Judah, obedient to God and his laws, but his son's reign will be very brief. And so that brings us to the end of this lesson. We've gone right through the whole story and life of Rehoboam. So next week we're going to have a look at Abiah's reign. It is much more brief. We've put all of Rehoboam's journey into one lesson. It makes it a little bit longer, but it's a bit hard to split it into 2 fragments. So I pray that you understand that. So thank you very much for joining us. I hope you have learned a lot and understand that the blessings and the curses that come out of the Bible from times much earlier are still affecting the generations during the time of kings, and they will continue to do so through the period of kings. So thank you for joining us. God bless you, and we look forward to your company next week.